Hello and welcome back to another episode of LeadHERs in Tech, the podcast sharing wisdom and experiences of female leaders, paving the way for the next generation of women in the tech industry. Today, I'm really thrilled to be speaking to Gabs Bojilova, a remarkable young leader and definitely one to watch in the tech industry. Currently, Gabs is the UK SDR Manager at Employment Hero, and despite being early on in her career, Gabs has already shown what an ambitious young woman can achieve in tech. Today, we're going to be exploring her insights into building confidence, overcoming imposter syndrome, and as well as the importance of representation for aspiring women in tech. So, Gabs, it's wonderful to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Emily. Really, really great to be here as well.
Great. So to start, I'd really love to hear about a female leader who has given you inspiration that you've used in your career so far.
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and I would take it back to my job in tech sales, actually. The particular female leader that I have in reference didn't actually start until about a year into me being in this company. It was a company called Tessian, and we had somebody start who came in from Uber, and she was just brilliant. She started as head of sales operations, eventually made her way up into the VP role there, but she was my manager's manager, so 2 levels above, and I'd say she was a huge inspiration because of the expertise and the knowledge she brought in, but the humbleness with which she led, despite having this great career behind her. Always treated every opportunity as something new, as a way to grow herself, and almost like never stop learning. And for me, that was truly inspirational, and almost inspired me to just ask way more questions as well. In at that time in my career, when I was going for promotion as well, she helped me to understand what I needed to do to get to the next stages, and almost had her as a bit of a mentor, essentially. And so ultimately for me, that was a good fountain of inspiration to have seen someone who's been successful in their careers. It was great to have her to almost look up to within the business when she joined, and just to see how much respect she was able to bring as well coming into this, and being new, but being able to make her own path in the business, and for other people to look up to her as well. So I'd say that for me, that she was definitely a big inspiration.
Yeah, it's interesting because actually, when I was doing some research before our call today, I was finding that there's a lot of studies indicating that having a role model in a leadership position can significantly influence your career path. And it sounds like she provided some of that for you in terms of kind of giving you that person to look up to. I'm curious, before she joined, because you mentioned she joined a year after you'd started there, what was it like in that environment then? Did you have other people who you kind of could look up to, or was this almost like your first experience of seeing somebody in tech in that kind of way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually picked up on having said that as well, and it was sort of a year after I started. But I think I definitely had some other people that I could turn to and look up to. Probably didn't maybe have the exact same effect, given that those people were more my equals than someone who'd kind of gone and done it before. But I had a lot of admiration and took a lot of encouragement, inspiration from some of my other colleagues at the time. Somebody called Bethan was someone I looked up to hugely. Karina as well, who's in a different department. And they were people who we were on kind of similar growth paths and journeys, having started at the same time as well in the business. And it was great to see how much commitment and dedication they had to their own careers, and how they sort of behaved in the workplace, given it was my first role, and for them it certainly wasn't. And so it really showed me sort of how I wanted to my image to be, perceived as well in the business. And so having them on that journey absolutely helped as well, before sort of seeing a more senior person and leader figure come into the business. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's great to have people alongside you, almost not necessarily in the same role, but on the same trajectory, to see the different ways that people are, going about the same kind of conversations and the same kind of stages in their career. I'm interested. You chose somebody specifically inside tech and inside that world of work that you've been in. Considering the broader impact of female representation, like politics, films, arts, how much do you think that representation in those areas earlier on in life perhaps trickle down into more technical fields or your confidence in going into leadership?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question and a really powerful one as well. I think it can't be underestimated or overstated how much having female representation in different areas of life and society can have on someone. I definitely wouldn't have been able to probably, if you'd asked me when I was in school who I look up to and who is an inspiration to me or a role model, probably would have struggled to pick someone in every industry, and it probably would have been biased to industries that get more representation, such as actors, right, singers, and more the entertainment industry. But when it comes to the more traditional jobs or fields, I think would have struggled to pick out someone. It's absolutely going to be super important. And it still is important for me, even though, now I'm in a career and a much different place than a decade ago or so. It's absolutely vital to have that representation. And to be honest, there's definitely a lack of it, even though there's maybe
Mm.
been some improvements over the years. There's absolutely a lack of it. I was looking at Fortune 500 CEOs, and it's something like 10.4% of them are actually female. And so even now, when business has grown and is bigger than ever, the economy is thriving, there's a lack of representation. And if you ask me to name any female CEOs from Fortune 500, I'd struggle. I probably could name men, but again, it's because of that representation as well, right? And in the media, and not just the volume side of it.
Absolutely, because even when somebody is in that position, do they get more coverage as a man from a media perspective? One of the things that you just mentioned was about seeing people in the more traditionally diverse industries like film, etc. And actually, I was looking at some the gender disparities in film, and obviously it's broadcasted a lot about the pay gap, but that's not specifically what I was interested by. When a woman is in a lead role in a film versus a man in a lead role in a film, the man will, on average, get double the amount of minutes of speaking time than the
Wow.
woman who is also in the lead role. So even in those films that are representing women, the female parts are actually not as dominating in the film as they are in films with a male lead. And the stats are even worse if you look at films where there's a man and a woman both kind of co-leading, and notoriously the male part will have significantly more screen time than the woman. So there's kind of still that second best mentality around it from that perspective, which is such a shame, really, I think, because we seem to be making steps forward by having more female leads, but they're not actually given the same exposure as the male leads, even when they are broadcasted as such.
Yeah, wow, that is a shocking statistic, and I'd be interested in finding out in that situation as well. What are the numbers like for screenwriters, directors, right? I think we also know it's way more male dominated at that level in the film industry, and ultimately it's the people who write those scripts, right, who give different characters or different parts more screen time, and wonder how those sort of biases would play into that.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. I suppose it goes as far as well when we look at politics, when we look at prime ministers, even just for the UK, that representation, it's not been there. And even when it is there, the perception that people get for Margaret Thatcher is not necessarily a very warm reception. I'm sure that actually most politicians get not necessarily the warmest response from the public, but certainly the idea that these women in high powered positions are not caring, very harsh, not warm, right? I think when I was younger, my perception of people in the media who were leaders in a female position was that they were really ruthless and cutthroat, and you had to be that way to be a successful woman. That's what I saw when I was a kid, and not necessarily the most inviting idea of I want to be that kind of woman, because I don't know if anybody plans to be that kind of cutthroat, ruthless woman.
Yeah. No, I completely get that and agree. I think, yeah, we've seen, especially in recent years, how those particular prime ministers have been portrayed, right? And when we study history as well, I do remember studying a lot of that, British politics in school, and certainly do remember at the time, it's almost like, especially when it's in the past, right? And it's historical, you view them as characters in something that's to you is fictional because it's not existing at the time of reading it, but you almost then start to develop biases towards those particular characters, right, as well. And
Yeah.
so it's always like, yeah, the good guys, the bad guys, etc. And it's interesting how that gets portrayed as early as in school when you study history, right? Whether it's gender or even beyond, there's always some sort of bias based on the person, like we were saying with screenwriters or directors, based on the person who's kind of directing or orchestrating this piece of coverage. There's going to
Yeah.
be their bias reflected in that, and so who are the people who are putting this out? And it happens day in day out with everything. I think even when I was reading through some of the statistics for the Fortune 500, I think there was an article that said more than 10% of Fortune 500 companies are led by women. And I was thinking it's not more than, it's only.
That's quite deceptive, isn't it? I think when we think about this outside of tech, when you are then in an environment that is still male dominated, how does that previous lack of representation manifest itself in the way that we interact, or you have seen people interacting in the workplace?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think ultimately when you don't see someone who's like you in one way or another in a position that maybe you want to take in the future, or in general in any sort of leadership position, regardless of the industry, it does give you a bit of self-doubt, right? And maybe you start questioning your confidence a little bit. And I think for myself as well, I've definitely had that in the past. Definitely when first starting out in my career, even before tech sales, in recruitment, I absolutely never imagined being in the leadership role, and there were no female leaders at that first business that I was at.
Right.
And so for me, it was almost like it's not the norm, or it's not typical for this to happen, and therefore you
Mm.
kind of believe it a little bit less. Obviously it's a possibility rationally and logically, like, yeah, I can do it if I want to, and I'm sure it's possible. It's kind of
Yeah.
what you tell yourself, but it's the confidence that you lack and the self-doubt that is much bigger than it probably would be if you did have enough representation and enough support, enough mentors to reach out to, people who are right in front of you who've done it before, that you can ask for guidance, advice, etc., who would give you that sense of possibility, so to speak. So yeah, absolutely, I'd say it manifests itself, and I have experienced it firsthand, and I'm sure there are loads of others who would say the same. And
Yeah.
imposter syndrome itself is a massive thing that is talked about ever since I've started, actually, for the last 5 years. I think there's at least a few events a year that cover imposter syndrome that I've been to, and it's universal, and it doesn't feel like it's going away.
Apparently 70% of people experience imposter syndrome at some point in their life. We're always told, I suppose, in the media that it's more prevalent in women than in men. I definitely know that women will talk about it more, and it comes up in a lot of conversations that we're having. So how, I guess, in your career so far, have you navigated that kind of feeling, especially if you're stepping into a new role or doing something that you've not done before and trying to kind of challenge yourself and step outside of your comfort zone?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is talking about it and being open about it. I think if you start to internalize those feelings, they're going to probably get to you, and you be stifling yourself and almost self-sabotaging if you don't talk about it.
Mm.
Absolutely, the managers and the leaders I've shared, if I've ever felt imposter syndrome, it fluctuates as well. It's not something that is constant, I'd say, at least not in my experience. But if there's a big project or anything that maybe like requires public speaking, or whatever it might be, that's when, of course, it does get a little bit more intense. But speaking about it, letting people know, because sometimes the way you gain courage is by being encouraged. And so seeking that encouragement from my leaders and my peers. And now, even now as a manager, I do still experience imposter syndrome, of course. And a way I go about it is actually leading with vulnerability. Sometimes if I'm lacking confidence in something, or just having that imposter syndrome moment, I will just share it with the team, say like, look, I'm going to make mistakes as much as you are, and we're all here
Mm.
to learn. Um, and so I think putting it out there makes it less scary, basically.
I think the vulnerability piece is so important because potentially there's a fear there that vulnerability shows weakness or means that we're not kind of strong and confident, but actually being able to build a strong enough relationship with your team to be able to say that, it just opens the door for you to have a lot more confidence in trying something that's hard, or new to you, because you have exposed yourself to say, this is new, I'm going to try it, it may work, it may not work, but I'm going to try it anyway. And that's great role modeling for the people in your team. How did they receive that kind of vulnerability from you? What kind of response did you get to saying that?
Yeah. So the first time I took this kind of approach was when I first moved into management at my previous business, and actually the response was really positive. And I think it definitely allowed us to connect more on not just the manager rep level, but also just person to person, right? And it makes people realize that actually you're also just human. Yeah, you've got this title. Yeah, you're maybe somewhere higher up in the hierarchy, but at the end of the day, you are also just a person who's on their own journey and learning and failing and learning from that and succeeding, etc. And so I think it really breaks down any sort of invisible barriers or hierarchies that you have with people. And sometimes it's a great way for them to see you as, we're on the same team, we're in this together,
Yeah.
and helping each other out. And I think it's important to foster that environment and not just stick to the traditional relationships of managers and their reps. And so it was received really positively, and it's something that I've, I guess, been positively reinforced to keep doing. But of course, sometimes I've questioned myself and thought, would I appear as maybe like lacking some sort of conviction in what I'm doing if I lead with vulnerability? But I just remind myself of how well it was received the first time, and actually
Mm.
how my manager in the past as well led with vulnerability, and how that made me feel and made me want to work harder for him
Yeah.
when he did express that level of vulnerability. And so yeah, those reminders just, yeah, make it easier to go for it and not let the imposter syndrome win, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking back right now on some of the leaders I've had who've led with vulnerability, if nothing else, it makes me respect them more, because there's a whole bunch of people in leadership who have made it to leadership because they've been very good at the job they were doing before going into leadership, and unfortunately maybe aren't actually as strong in their leadership role. And I've definitely been in situations before where I've looked to somebody more senior than me who is acting like they know it all, and I'm thinking, you do not have a clue what you're doing. And actually somebody who comes and says, hey, I haven't done this before and I'm going to try, and if it fails then we'll change something, and if it doesn't fail then amazing, and thanks for being on the journey with me. I'll hear that and I'll think, good for them. I want them to succeed. I love the fact that they're trying, versus the person who thinks they know it all but is messing up and can't kind of take accountability for the fact that it's their learning. So I do think it's such a valuable and powerful approach to have. So good for you for starting that approach early on in your leadership career. I think it's gonna pave a good way for your long-term future as a leader.
Yeah, thank you. And now that you've just said that, it's made me think as well. You maybe come across a bit of as an underdog, right? And we know that most people, if not everyone, loves an underdog, right? And loves to see
Yeah.
them succeed. Painting yourself a bit in that light, so to speak, by taking that approach. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I think is quite interesting is that while we're still talking about imposter syndrome, there's a study from the Harvard Business Review that basically says that more presence of imposter syndrome will result in less career progression. It sounds like you've had some experience of imposter syndrome, but you seem to be doing very well in the perspective of career progression. How do you kind of overcome those doubts in the moments where you're trying to take a step in your career?
Yeah, it's quite a journey, right? And I've been really lucky to have great leaders around me to give me those opportunities when I thought I couldn't take them or wasn't ready to take them. And I think that absolutely has been a massive contributor to me being able to be where I am today. On the personal level and how I've worked through those is I love a self-help book. I almost only read nonfiction. And one book that really, springs to mind that's helped me is Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And ultimately in that book, I don't want to spoil it for people, but the idea is that the biggest fear of all that underlies every other fear that you can ever imagine in life is just the fear that you can't handle it.
Mm.
And so once you realize that actually the real thing you're fearing here is that you can't handle it, but then you've got all of these examples in your past that you've just been reminded of by your peers or your manager or you yourself by making a list so that you keep yourself grounded. When you're reminded of all those situations that you've actually overcome or overachieved in, been great in, even when you thought you weren't going to, and then you realize actually I am worthy of this promotion or I am worthy of taking this opportunity, like why shouldn't I almost?
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, realizing that the worst that could happen is probably not as bad as you think. It has definitely given me that faith and confidence to just go for it almost. And like the title of the book, just feel the fear and do it anyway. That is again just not to underestimate the power of having people who encouraged me as well, right, along the way, whether that be friends and managers, leaders, makes it easier for you to believe in yourself if others do as well. So that's absolutely, yeah, how I've been able to overcome that, I guess, but I'm still overcoming it. Disclaimer.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that you mentioned about the encouragement and the people around you are kind of maybe helping you to go forward on that process. How do you make sure that internally within a company, as you're thinking about approaching career progression, how do you ensure your visibility and recognition for the achievements that you've had internally?
Yeah, so with this one, I think it's important in any business, in any role, you've got to be aware that you do have a brand image and there's things that you need to be doing internally to build that brand and to sustain it as well and to create allies, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it's something I learned in my first job, and which is why I'm really grateful for that experience and the people I met along the way, who are some of the people I mentioned earlier who've been inspirational to me. And it's because I learned then that you really need to create champions for yourself and allies internally. Find someone who's got a similar path to you or is maybe a few steps ahead of your journey, right?
Mm.
Ask them to mentor you, right? Find a mentor internally. It doesn't have to be anything that's time consuming. It's maybe half an hour every 2 weeks or even half an hour a month. Once they get to know your journey and you are able to articulate what it is that you want and seek their advice, implement their advice, right? Put it into action, update them in 2 weeks when you've done the thing they've told you about doing, and suggested in your previous conversation, etc. That's how you sort of build these champions. When there is an opportunity for you to get promoted, you've got backing of several people that you've been able to turn into champions for yourself. And so that's the thing that's really really helped, and showcasing, right, showing those people what you're doing every time you speak to them, whether they're the same level as you or superior, etc. Almost being able to bring to them examples about what you've done and ask for their feedback on those said examples, etc., or achievements, projects, tasks, whatever it might be, conversations you have with your team, whatever it is, show them and talk to them about it so that they buy into your journey and therefore they now want to support you and see you succeed as well. So that's absolutely something that's helped me get a few promotions as well in
Yeah.
tech sales. So yeah, would absolutely recommend to people to find those key people and turn them into champions.
When we think about the term champion, the formal definition is a defender of a cause, right? Comes from the olden days when knights would fight on behalf of their king. So when we think maybe from a medic perspective or a tech sales perspective, we all often will say it's someone who will fight for you when you're not in the room. When you're creating these champions and you've got 5 or 6 people in the company and then you come up for a promotion, are you trying to engineer a situation where they will either put you forward for a role, proactively speak to another senior team member to advocate for you in that role? Or is it more from that perspective of encouragement for you and kind of giving you the confidence to go for the role by yourself? Like, how much do you get them involved in that process?
Yeah, great question. I think I would say it's definitely a bit of both. Ultimately, you can't control how much they will get involved in the process. It's ultimately going to be up to them whether they get involved at all or not. But the things within your control, and we love to use the term champions and control the controllables in sales, don't we? But ultimately, it's controlling the controllables, right? If I know that I've spoken to those people, sought their advice, the win for me is that I've got proven guidance on things that work, and I've got expert opinions or suggestions on what to do to advance my career. So the benefit to me is having that relationship and having that mentorship. And then the added level of that benefit is the likelihood of those people becoming advocates for you is much higher because they do know you, they are invested in you in one way or another. And therefore, you can trust that if, even if they're not directly the person who's going to be influencing your promotion, if they get asked, what do you think about this person, or like, do you think this person's ready, etc., they have so much more information than they ever would have had without you seeking mentorship guidance from them. So it's absolutely both those things. Even if they don't ever end up becoming advocates for you, you've gained so much in the process anyway.
Yeah, that is such good advice. I think something that everyone can really take away and think about who in their company could be those people for them. Gabs, one of the things that we spoke about when we were discussing you coming on as a guest was the Dream Gap video, which the Barbie brand actually released
Yeah.
recently. For me, when I watched it, quite an emotional watch. I have a young daughter, so I was looking at it maybe through her eyes in a few years. For anybody who's not seen the video, again, I'll link it, but the concept is that it's such an early stage in life when girls start to doubt that they can do the same thing that boys can do, especially in areas like science and tech, which has an impact on how many ultimately might want to come into a career in SaaS. And so we were talking about the impact that video could potentially have on helping to educate people in how we close that gap. Would you say that you've seen any things that you think could be contributing to people not even thinking that a career in tech is for them?
Yeah. That video is super, super powerful and yeah, definitely made me emotional as well. I think if you haven't watched it, definitely worth watching. And I love what Barbie is doing with the Dream Gap. And it's a whole initiative beyond that video, which I didn't know about. And I think it sends a powerful message. It's kind of what we were talking about as well before. If you don't see it, can you really believe it? You know, I think it manifests itself across different industries. So, for example, I am a huge basketball fan, and very recently in March, there was the national championships happening in the States. They received more coverage than ever. And it's something that, as you know, a spectator, but also as a woman who loves and plays basketball, it just made me so proud and emotional and just incredibly happy that there is now way more visibility and coverage of this. But even so, statistically speaking, before 2022, there was only 5% coverage for female sports in the States, according to ESPN, which is crazy. It's nearly tripled now to 15%. But even so, you can see even within sports how that manifests itself. And if little girls can't see who they can become or what they can be, how's that going to encourage anyone? Again, it's that word encouragement. How's that going to encourage people or show them that there is a possibility for them and there is a path for them to pursue? And so it's going to be incredibly important to keep doing that. And ultimately, we've seen that it does make an impact. If you give the spotlight to women to shine, it can contribute to more revenue or more visibility, more opportunities, right, in different environments. As you said, in film, the statistics are are pretty shocking, and in sports still, in politics, especially in the UK. And it's no different to tech sales. It kind of manifests itself across every industry that you can
Yeah.
think of, really. And so it's going to be a case of a joint responsibility in society from the people who are in it and the people who are spectators to demand more coverage, show
Yeah.
society that this is better for the economy, better for, our future generations, in order to be able
Mm.
to gain more investment, generate more interest in different fields, and really pave a path for women and anyone who's from a minority background to know that it is possible and to pursue it and remove obstacles along the way. And it sounds really ideal, but I think until we get to that point, it's going to be a pretty long time and require a lot of effort, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned basketball because Caitlin Clark, she just became the number one pick for the women's NBA, right? But her contract was 338,000 for 4 years. But then you compare that to the number one draft pick for the men's, and his 4 year contract was like 50 million plus. The disparity is absolutely ridiculous. So I suppose it's good that the coverage is going up. The coverage needs to go up to get more interest in the women's sport, to then therefore get more funding, to then sponsors and the pay to catch up. That's almost a trickle down effect that we need to become more interested. And same with women's football, and obviously the women's England team's doing great work for that. But if we can't do that even in such a popular and entertainment style space, then I suppose it's difficult to even consider how people are going to start sort of advocating for the more dry subjects like tech and workplace considerations from that perspective. It's definitely something that everybody needs to be involved in, and everybody needs to drive that mentality around making improvements and demanding change to happen for everyone, not just women. Like you've mentioned, diversity goes a lot further than just your gender. There's a lot more to go into from the perspective of other marginalized communities. We actually finish up the podcast episode with the same question for each of our guests. And that question is for you to share with us the best piece of advice that you have received from a leader in tech.
Yeah, I love this question. It's amazing. I think it's a bit of a cliche, but to be honest, I'm very cheesy and I do love cliches. So that's probably why it's stuck with me. But it's ultimately, you can only be yourself and nobody else, right? Speaking of role models and speaking of the people that you look up to and can see, it's a little bit tricky when you can't see those people, right? Fitting to the theme that we were speaking about today, you can't imagine almost walking those footsteps, but it's also a reminder that actually it's not their footsteps that you have to walk into, it's your own. And so for me, it's quite an empowering piece of advice, because it's all about, if the way isn't paved for you, then you can be the person who paves that way. And so that's for me like quite an inspirational, be yourself and be the person who paves that way for other people, right? And it's not an easy thing to do, but it's ultimately to increase your confidence and to just allow you to really own it. Be the person that you didn't have when you were starting out your career. Be
Yeah.
that person for others, especially as a manager, and would love to be able to inspire someone in their journey.
That's really good advice. I'm starting to get a bit of a theme coming through, that a lot of the advice that's really resonating with people that they want to then kind of share on in this question is about that authenticity and really being yourself. So thanks for reiterating that point. This has been a great conversation. I really love the fact that we got into some statistics around what it's like to be a woman, imposter syndrome, representation. We've gone beyond tech and tried to think about what the impact of those outside of work environments, the watching TV, watching films, thinking about who you were going to vote for in the local election the other week. And I love the fact that we've considered how that can have an impact on people in tech, but also young girls, and considering the dream gap and how we can drive more positivity, really come together as a collective to shape the future and change things for the best. So Thank you so much for taking the time and coming on to talk about these things. I do think that you are a really positive leader for people to learn from. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate being here and hearing your words. I think it's amazing what you're doing with the podcast, and I'll be sure to tune into all of your episodes as well, because I think it's such a great initiative. And I remember you telling me the reason why you started this as well, and how that relates to your daughter and building a better place and for her in the future as well. So really awesome to have been here. Privilege for me as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of LeadHERs in Tech. Your support means the world to us, and we're incredibly grateful for the opportunity to share these empowering stories with you. If you're listening on a podcast platform and you believe in our mission to amplify the voices of women in tech, please take a moment to leave us a rating. It really helps us grow and reach more listeners. And don't forget to subscribe and share this episode with others. Anyone watching on YouTube, engagement makes a big difference, so please subscribe to our channels and give this episode a like and share. If you resonated with any of the topics today or have some similar experiences, then we want to hear from you in the comments section. Let's keep the conversation going. Your contribution is not just a favour, it's a powerful step towards change. Remember, every story shared and every voice heard can ignite a spark in someone's career. So, if you know an amazing woman with a story that needs to be heard, please nominate them. Thanks again for listening and for being part of this journey.